While she was born in Fairfield, California, Sasha Banks wouldn't have a traditional childhood. Her family moved around a lot in order to find hospitals and schools that could care for Banks' brother, who had autism. This is a tough way to grow up, but Sasha had something to help her out. Wrestling. Looking forward to watching Raw and SmackDown is what Banks said saved her life. Because of this, Sasha knew all she wanted to be was a wrestler. Once her family settled in Boston, Massachusetts, the future boss laced up her boots and began training at a nearby school called Chaotic Wrestling. Sasha spent the next 2 years learning the ropes and developing her persona. In 2010, at the age of 18, Banks competed in her first ever wrestling match under the name Mercedes KV, Mercedes being Sasha Banks' real name and KV being her last initials. It didn't take long for people to notice that this girl from Boston had something. In 2012, Sasha Banks participated in a WWE tryout and was signed after spending a little under 2 years as an independent wrestler. Banks was sent to WWE's new Performance Center at the time to undergo further training. This is where she would come up with the name Sasha Banks, but the boss persona came later. After a few months, it was time for the world to witness the debut of Sasha Banks. On December 12, 2012, a bright, upbeat Sasha skipped her way into a WWE ring for the very first time. Banks got to start at the top, as her opponent was one of the best female wrestlers on the roster, Paige. The two women started the match by grappling. They battled to get the advantage. That went to Paige once she got Sasha in a pair of head scissors. Sasha finally managed to escape and followed up with some hip tosses and a slap to the face. Sasha Banks then took her opponent for a ride with a top rope arm drag. Paige fought back by grabbing Sasha's hair and chucking her across the ring. The anti-diva then got more technical with a fisherman suplex, but Sasha Banks kicked out. Knowing that Paige had more experience, Sasha tried to roll her up for the quick pin, but had no luck. Paige repaid the young Banks with a kick to the gut and then her finisher, the Paige Turner. Sasha Banks' shoulders stayed glued to the mat for the 3 count and the fight was over. Not much of a match. It wasn't a squash or anything, but there wasn't a whole lot of substance. Even though this is NXT, this match still had that diva feel to it, with the hair pulling and everything. The match wasn't bad at all, but it's nothing compared to what Sasha Banks would do later, as we'll see soon. After losing her debut match, Sasha got her first win in her third match against Alicia Fox. Soon after, Banks began a storyline where she started receiving letters from a secret admirer. Sasha would have to wait a few weeks to find out who was behind these romantic messages. It turned out to be another female wrestler named Audrey Marie. The entire thing was actually a trick. Marie was jealous of Sasha Banks' success and used the letters to make fun of her, and she ended up sneak attacking the future boss backstage. That same night, Audrey Marie and Sasha Banks went one-on-one, with Marie getting the better of Banks. However, Sasha would defeat Audrey in 2 tag team matches, which ended the feud. Later that year, a tournament was set up to crown the first NXT Women's Champion. Sasha Banks entered, but lost in the first round to Summer Rae. Speaking of Summer, she would try to rile up Sasha and told her she wasn't relevant. This led to Banks attacking the NXT Women's Champion, Paige, after losing to her in a match. Additionally, this marked the beginning of Sasha Banks' boss persona. Sasha would officially partner with Summer Rae, and they began calling themselves the Beautiful Fierce Females, or BFFs. Later, Charlotte would also join the group, turning it into a trio. At first, this partnership was a good thing for Sasha, and she started picking up win after win. However, once 2014 rolled around, Sasha would begin a losing streak and wouldn't get another win until late April. Perhaps because of this lack of success, tension began to mount in the BFFs. The group would stay together for a few more months, but the breaking point came in July 2014. After Sasha Banks and Charlotte won a tag team match, the master of the figure 8 left Banks alone in the ring to get beaten up by their opponents. Following this, the BFFs would officially split up. Sasha tried to challenge Charlotte for the NXT Women's Championship, but lost a number 1 contenders match to Bayley. Bayley and Charlotte would go at it at TakeOver Fatal 4-Way, where Charlotte retained her title. After the match, Sasha attacked Bayley and didn't stop until her former BFF member forced her to. Over the next few months, Sasha would continue to feud with Bayley. The rivalry got even more heated when Bayley's friend, Becky Lynch, attacked her and joined up with Banks. The two would take on Bayley and Charlotte in a tag team match that Sasha and Becky won. This made way for an NXT Women's Championship match at TakeOver R Evolution between the former BFFs. Despite the boss's best efforts, she could not dethrone the Queen and failed to capture the gold. It's worth mentioning that shortly after TakeOver R Evolution, Sasha and Charlotte would face off on Main Event, which was the first time Sasha appeared on the main roster. However, the result of that match was still the same. Sasha Banks and Charlotte went at it again in early 2015. However, this time, Becky Lynch would run in and attack Charlotte, causing Sasha to lose by disqualification. This would eventually lead to Banks and Lynch parting ways. A few weeks later, Sasha got another opportunity at the women's title when she found herself in a fatal four-way match against Charlotte, Becky Lynch, and Bayley. Finally, though, Sasha Banks got the win and was the new NXT Women's Champion. As champion, she first defended the title against Charlotte and was successful. The Boss would also win matches against Alexa Bliss and Becky Lynch. During her title reign, Sasha officially made her debut on the main roster. On July 13, 2015, Stephanie McMahon called for a revolution in WWE's women's division. Sasha Banks, along with Becky Lynch and Charlotte, would all debut following the announcement. All three women aligned themselves with the team, with Banks joining Naomi and Tamina, who called themselves Team Beautiful and Dangerous, or BAD for short. While faction warfare was breaking out on the main roster, Sasha Banks continued to hold the Women's Championship in NXT. That was until she was defeated by her old rival, Bayley, at NXT TakeOver Brooklyn. Banks would get a rematch a few months later in the first ever Iron Woman match, but also came up short. Back on the main roster, Team BAD was feuding with Team Bella, as well as Team PCB. All three groups would trade wins and losses. Despite not winning every match she was a part of, Banks would avoid being pinned for the first few months on the main roster. The Boss disappeared for a short while at the end of 2015, but returned at the 2016 Royal Rumble pay-per-view, where she attacked Charlotte and Becky Lynch after their Divas Championship match. Just like in NXT, Sasha would be in pursuit of Charlotte and her Divas title. Soon after, Sasha Banks said she was done with Team BAD, which prompted Naomi and Tamina to attack her during a match. This began a mini rivalry that ended at Fastlane when Sasha teamed up with her former friend, Becky Lynch, to defeat Team BAD. With that out of the way, Banks turned her attention back to the Divas Championship. Becky and Sasha would face off in a number one contender match, but neither woman won due to a double pin. They had a rematch, but this time the champion, Charlotte, interfered and attacked Banks and Lynch. It was then decided that both the Boss and the Future Man would compete in a triple threat match at WrestleMania 32 against Charlotte. At the event, the Divas Championship was retired, and the Women's Championship was introduced. Unfortunately, Sasha Banks did not have her hand raised in her WrestleMania debut, and Charlotte Flair won the title. The Boss wouldn't do a ton over the next few months, but she did start a small winning streak. Things got interesting again when Sasha came out and attacked Charlotte Flair and Charlotte's new partner, Dana Brooke. Banks would team up with a few different wrestlers to take on Charlotte and Dana, and always came out on top. Finally, Sasha Banks got a one-on-one title match with the Queen. After going back and forth for a while, Sasha locked in the Banks statement and wouldn't let go, forcing Charlotte to tap. While this was a big victory, the celebration was short-lived. About a month later, at SummerSlam, Banks and Flair had their rematch. Even with Dana Brooke banned from ringside, Charlotte managed to knock off the Boss and take back the Women's Championship. Banks got another shot at the title at Clash of Champions, but this time, Bayley joined the fight. Because of this, Charlotte walked away with the gold again after she pinned Bayley. However, Sasha would get her one-on-one rematch shortly thereafter, and, just like before, Sasha used the Banks statement to regain the Women's Championship, which is now called the Raw Women's Championship. With 2 title reigns under her belt, Sasha, as well as Charlotte, would make history by having a rematch at Hell in a Cell. Not only was it the first female Hell in a Cell match, but Banks and Flair became the first women to main event a WWE pay-per-view. Despite all that, Sasha Banks would crumble to the Queen again and lose the Raw Women's Championship. However, just like last time, Sasha and Charlotte had another rematch on Raw. This time, they fought in a Falls Count Anywhere match and made full use of that stipulation. Banks eventually slid Charlotte Flair through some railing and used the Banks statement to become a 3-time Raw Women's Champion. Now, just guess what happened next. Charlotte and Sasha had a rematch at the next pay-per-view, Roadblock, and guess what? Charlotte won. Although the match did have a stipulation that Banks couldn't invoke her rematch clause if she lost, so this thankfully put an end to the Sasha vs. Charlotte cycle. In total, combining all 3 of Sasha Banks' Raw Women's Championship reigns in 2016, she only held the title for 74 days. Okay, let's just move on. The night after she lost the title, Sasha came out to congratulate Charlotte, but Nia Jax walked out instead and attacked the Boss. The two went at it at the 2017 Royal Rumble, where Jax got the better of Sasha Banks. Sasha wasn't done with Nia yet, but in the meantime, she had to help out a friend. During a Raw Women's Championship match, Sasha Banks attacked the champion, who was still Charlotte. This allowed Bayley to get the pin and win the Raw Women's title. Bayley had been Sasha's tag team partner during Banks' feud with Charlotte and Dana Brooke, which is why Sasha helped Bayley out. It might have also had a little something to do with Charlotte trash-talking Sasha earlier that night, but whatever. Banks still had unfinished business with Nia Jax, so they fought again at Fastlane. This time, Banks got the better of Nia and won, making her the first person to defeat Jax on the main roster. This rivalry with Nia Jax, as well as the stuff going on with Bayley and Charlotte, morphed into one big Fatal 4-Way match at WrestleMania 33 for the Raw Women's Championship. Unfortunately, like last year, Sasha Banks didn't get her big WrestleMania victory and left the grandest stage of them all without the title. The Boss would get another opportunity about 2 months later when she won a gauntlet match to become the #1 contender. Banks faced the Raw Women's Champion, who is now Alexa Bliss, at Great Balls of Fire. While Sasha would win, Alexa lost via countout as she retained the title. Not satisfied with that, Banks would defeat former rival Nia Jax to become the #1 contender again. Sasha got her match at SummerSlam, and, unlike last year, the Boss came out on top and had finally regained the Raw Women's Championship. This began a long and prestigious title reign that would become the most iconic part of Sasha Banks' No, Sasha lost the title back to Alexa Bliss 8 days after SummerSlam. It's like she's allergic to red and white belts. You know what I'm allergic to? My balls. No, wait, rubbing my balls on my legs. No, that didn't work. Let me explain. Alright fellas, we've all been there. You're walking or running, and your nuts start rubbing up against your leg. Hey, you can't help that they're that big, but you still got a problem. Well, that's where Sheath, the sponsor of this video, comes in. Sheath boxers are designed to keep you comfortable and help stop chafing. How do they do this? Sheath boxers have a pouch to store your nuts and screw, helping prevent skin-to-skin contact and the need to readjust. I can say from personal experience, they feel great, especially during the summer. They're so comfortable that I'm wearing them right now as I say this. What, too much information? Tell your boys you love them. Click the link below and use code TAPOUT at checkout, or go to sheathunderwear.com/tapout for 20% off. That's sheathunderwear.com/tapout, or just click the link below and use code TAPOUT for 20% off. Thank you to Sheath for keeping Tap Out Corner in the fight and keeping my balls comfy. Anyways, Sasha would need to go balls to the wall if she wanted to win back the Raw Women's Championship. The Boss competed in a fatal 5-way match at No Mercy, but she had no luck getting the title back. In late 2017, Sasha was wrestling a match against Mickie James. The match was interrupted by the return of Paige, and she brought with her Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville. The three women called themselves Absolution, but it was an absolute fact that Sasha Banks wasn't just gonna walk away. Banks teamed up with Mickie James, as well as Bayley, and the two sides began a war. In the middle of this, the first ever Women's Royal Rumble match would take place in January 2018. Banks was the first entrant, and while she didn't win, she did last the longest at over 54 minutes. At the next pay-per-view, both Sasha Banks and Bayley competed in the first ever Women's Elimination Chamber match for the Raw Women's Championship. Despite having an alliance, Sasha Banks would take a cheap shot at Bayley. Even with that, neither Banks nor Bayley would win, but this did create animosity between them. The two brawled backstage, which finally led to them having a one-on-one match in April 2018. Unfortunately, neither woman won due to the Riot Squad interfering and attacking both of them. Banks would go on to fight the Riot Squad, but she did so without Bayley. However, Sasha and Bayley still weren't done and would continue to attack each other over the next several months. This ultimately led to the Raw General Manager, Kurt Angle, forcing them to attend relationship counseling. It actually did the trick, as the two made up and were back as a tag team, now officially known as the Boss and Hug Connection. Their first major feud was with the Riot Squad, and the two teams would trade wins and losses. At the Evolution pay-per-view, Sasha and Bayley teamed up with Natalya to take on all three members of the Riot Squad. Sasha's crew got the job done, and the Boss and Hug Connection continued to do well for the rest of 2018. In January 2019, Sasha Banks focused on her singles career again by defeating Nia Jax to become the #1 contender for the Raw Women's Championship. Sasha got her match at the Royal Rumble, but unfortunately, the champion was Ronda Rousey, who had never lost a singles match. The Boss couldn't break the undefeated streak and left the Rumble titleless. Despite the loss, Sasha Banks and Bayley would get to compete in an Elimination Chamber match to crown the first ever Women's Tag Team Champions. Unlike last year, the Boss and Hug Connection stood strong and ended up winning the match and the gold. Banks and Bayley had their first title defense at Fastlane against Tamina and Sasha's old rival, Nia Jax. I'm happy to say that Sasha Banks didn't lose the championship, and she and Bayley walked away with their hands held high. However, WrestleMania 35 was just around the corner, and the Boston Hug Connection would have to defend their tag team championship against 3 other teams. Despite their best efforts, Sasha Banks and Bayley got trampled by the numbers and lost their championship to the Iconics. Soon after, Sasha Banks would leave WWE. Rumors surfaced that she had asked for her release due to backstage frustrations. WWE wouldn't grant Banks her request, but did give her time off. The Boss returned in August 2019 with a new attitude and a new color of hair. She attacked Natalya and defeated her in her first match back. Sasha also reunited with Bayley, who is now the SmackDown Women's Champion and was also a heel. The two also attacked Becky Lynch and Charlotte Flair, which kicked off a feud between Banks and Becky. A match between them took place at Clash of Champions for Lynch's Raw Women's Championship. Banks ended up winning via disqualification after Becky Lynch accidentally hit the referee with a chair. 3 years after making history by participating in the first Women's Hell in a Cell match, Sasha Banks did it again by taking on Becky Lynch in the second Women's Hell in a Cell match. Unfortunately, like the first, Sasha Banks did not win, and she failed to capture the Raw Women's Championship. With that over, Sasha was drafted to SmackDown and was given a big responsibility, captaining the Women's Survivor Series team. Banks' team did put up a good fight, but failed to defeat Team NXT. After one defeat, Sasha would, unfortunately, experience another when she and Bayley failed to become 2-time tag team champions after losing a Fatal 4-Way match at Starrcade. 2020 did not start off any better for the Boss. Lacey Evans, someone who Bayley and Sasha had recently had some run-ins with, attacked Sasha backstage and injured her ankle. This put the Boss on the shelf for a few weeks, and she missed the 2020 Royal Rumble match because of it. Sasha Banks returned in late February and was back together with Bayley. In the weeks before WrestleMania 36, a fatal 5-way elimination match was set up for the SmackDown Women's Championship. Sasha Banks was one of the participants, and while she didn't win the match, Banks did help Bayley retain the title. The victory, though, began creating tension between both members of the Boston Hug Connection. Sasha Banks felt that Bayley wouldn't be SmackDown Women's Champ without her, and her argument was valid. Despite this growing resentment, Sasha and Bayley defeated Alexa Bliss and Nikki Cross to become 2-time Women's Tag Team Champions. While Tag Champ, Banks faced the Raw Women's Champion, Asuka, at Extreme Rules. During the match, Asuka accidentally sprayed green mist into the referee's face. Bayley took the ref's shirt and counted the pin for Sasha Banks, making Sasha the unofficial Raw Women's Champion. That would change, though, about a week later, when Banks officially defeated Asuka and became a 5-time Raw Women's Champion. So, 5th time's the charm. Sasha Banks would have a nice run at the title this time, right? Nope. 26 days later, Sasha Banks lost the championship back to the Empress Tomorrow in Banks' first title defense. Even more bad news would follow. 7 days later, Bayley and Banks lost the Women's Tag Team Championship to Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler. The Boston Hug Connection got their rematch shortly thereafter, but the result was still the same. This also caused an implosion, as Bayley attacked her tag team partner and put an end to their alliance. The two started trash-talking each other and threw a few fists at one another, which set up a one-on-one match for Bayley's SmackDown Women's Championship. During the fight, Bayley hit Sasha with a steel chair, causing a disqualification. Things could not end there, so a Hell in a Cell match was set up with the SmackDown Women's title on the line again. A third time in the cell did the trick for Sasha Banks. She defeated her former friend and won the SmackDown Women's Championship. Let's just hope a change in color would lead to a lengthier title reign. Banks had her first title defense about 2 weeks later in a rematch with Bayley. I'm pleased to say that the Boss did come out on top and remained SmackDown champion. There was no rest for Banks, though, as Carmella attacked her right after the successful title defense. After weeks of verbal and physical attacks, both Sasha and Carmella agreed to a match at TLC. Even though Carmella had her sommelier, Reginald, with her, the Boss brought the fight and ended 2020 with gold still around her waist. 2021 continued where the previous year left off, and Sasha Banks had one more title defense against Carmella, which went down the same way as the previous bout. Later that night, Bianca Belair won the Women's Royal Rumble, earning herself a title match at WrestleMania. After several weeks of build-up, Belair chose to challenge Sasha for the SmackDown Women's Championship. Despite being WrestleMania opponents, Sasha and Bianca would actually form a tag team together. They even got title matches against the Women's Tag Team Champions, Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler. Despite that, the Boston Whip Connection didn't win the gold. After that detour, Sasha and Bianca Belair put all their focus on WrestleMania 37. Just like in the past, Sasha made history by being part of the first WrestleMania main event to feature 2 black women. Despite that, Sasha's time was up and Belair's time was now. Not only did Banks lose the the SmackDown Women's Championship, but she also got a nasty mark courtesy of Belair's hair. However, Sasha Banks did get one win. Her single SmackDown Women's Championship reign lasted longer than all 5 of her Raw Women's title reigns combined. After the defeat, the Boss would be absent from WWE for a while. In July 2021, Bianca Belair was still champion, but had gotten attacked by Carmella and Zelina Vega. Just then, Sasha Banks made her return and saved her former rival. Later that night, Sasha and Belair teamed up to challenge and defeat Zelina and Carmella. However, the good times didn't last, and Banks made her true intentions clear by attacking Bianca. This was supposed to set up a rematch between the two women at SummerSlam, but for one reason or another, it didn't happen. Instead, Becky Lynch challenged Bianca Belair and won the SmackDown Women's title. Then, during Lynch and Belair's rematch, Sasha Banks made her second return and attacked both of them, causing a disqualification. This gave way to a triple threat match between Sasha, Becky, and Bianca at Crown Jewel. In the closing moments of the match, it looked like Banks was about to win, but quick thinking and a bit of leverage allowed Becky Lynch to retain the title. To close out the year, Sasha Banks was made captain of the SmackDown Women's Survivor Series team again. Even though NXT wasn't a part of the event this year, Sasha failed to lead her group to victory. 2022 started out on the wrong foot, with Sasha getting injured in early January. Fortunately, she recovered in time to compete in the Royal Rumble match. Unfortunately, the Boss wasn't the one who got a point at the WrestleMania sign. Later on, Sasha Banks would officially form a tag team with Naomi, after the two had tagged together a few times the previous year. Additionally, the Boss and Glow Connection said they would challenge for the Women's Tag Team Championship at WrestleMania 38. That probably wasn't the place to do it though. After all, Sasha had never won a match at WrestleMania. On the other hand, Banks and Naomi did pretty well in the weeks before Mania, so maybe this would swing things in their favor. At the grandest stage of them all, Sasha and Naomi faced Liv Morgan, Rhea Ripley, Natalya, Shayna Baszler, and the champions Carmella and Queen Zelina. Despite the odds, Sasha broke her WrestleMania curse. She and Naomi won the match and also got to walk away with championship gold. After the big win, Naomi and Banks had their first title defense against Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan, and thankfully retained. A few weeks later, the tag team champs had to defend their title against Natalya and Shayna Baszler. No one knew it, but this would be the last time Sasha and Naomi would be seen in WWE. Not only did Sasha Banks have gold around her waist and a friend by her side, but she also entered with a lot more attitude, at least compared to how she entered roughly 10 years earlier. Naomi started the match with Shayna Baszler, but once she stunned the Queen of Spades, the glowing one tagged in the Boss. The two gave boots to Shayna, which prompted Natalya to tag in. The best of all time started out very aggressive, but some quick thinking from Sasha Banks helped turn things around. Just like her strategy in her first WWE match, Sasha tried to put the match away quickly with some roll-ups, but like in 2012, they didn't get the job done. The Boss then tried to lock in the Banks statement, but Natalya was too strong. Sasha didn't let that get to her and tried to lock it in again, but Shayna Baszler was having none of it. After a commercial break, Natalya was back in the ring, and she was wearing down the Boss. Natalya and Shayna planted Banks with the heart attack, but Naomi broke up their pin and kept the match going. Sasha made a much needed tag to her partner, and Naomi started unloading. Despite hitting a few bumps and boots, Naomi held her own while Sasha Banks recovered. Banks briefly tagged back in, but she wasn't 100%. Thanks to all the chaos though, Naomi was able to roll up Natalya and retain their championship. Unfortunately, this match wasn't that special. It was just a basic TV match. Kind of like Sasha Banks' first match against Paige, this one was fine for what it was. The match was definitely faster paced compared to when Banks debuted, but it's partially due to the fact that it was a tag team match. One big difference between Sasha's first match in 2012 and her last in 2022 was the amount of offense. The energy in Banks' final match blows her debut out of the water. Again, it was a tag team match, but I think it at least had something to do with how WWE's women's division had changed between when Sasha Banks started in WWE and when she left it. 3 days after this match, Sasha Banks and Naomi were supposed to compete on Raw. However, a creative dispute led to both women packing their bags, leaving the women's tag team titles, and walking out. WWE made it clear this wasn't part of a storyline and that both women had legitimately walked out. It hasn't been 100% confirmed, but it's believed that Sasha Banks has been released from her contract. Ever since the walkout, Banks has been pretty quiet and has had limited public appearances. It's unknown what the future holds for the Boss, but one thing that is known is that you can watch every bell-to-bell video by hitting the playlist on screen.